In World War I, the battles were so intense and dangerous that soldiers had to start prioritizing protection over mobility. In doing so, they dug down into trenches. Trenches are long, deep ditches dug as protective, defensive, and most often associated with World War I. And the results of trench warfare in that conflict were hellish. The soldiers lived on a strict schedule and never let their guards down. Soldiers would have 1 hour shifts to out at nighttime. On their downtime, they would play cards and write letters to loved ones. Their diet consisted of corned beef, pea soup, and bread. Many diseases lived in the trenches, and diseases and war took a lot of lives.
Trenches were a tough place. Soldiers had to deal with the largest war the world had ever seen back then, disease, and very limited food. No man's land is commonly associated with World War I to describe the area of land between two enemy trench systems, which neither side wished to cross or seize for fear of being attacked by the enemy in the process. The majority of raids on trenches came in the night. Soldiers would snoop across no man's land, dodging mines, and would attack from the dark. Trench warfare in World War I was employed primarily on the Western Front, an area of northern France and Belgium that saw combat between German troops and Allied forces from France, Great Britain, and later the United States. Trench warfare caused enormous numbers of casualties and forced enemies to advance in their military technology to be able to attack against the opposition.
The trenches allowed military tactics such as hindering troops from readily advancing to the battlefront. In the front lines of World War I in France, they heavily relied on trench warfare. Both sides had built trenches, and in 3.5 years, the trenches barely moved from October 1914 to March 1918. Historians estimate T-hat soldiers had to build about 2,409 kilometers of trenches. On top of that, trenches were not dug in straight lines. They were built as a system. Specifically, they were built in a zigzag pattern with multiple levels. Trenches had barbed wire on top and were held together by wooden stalks and sandbags. There were three methods to make a trench. The first method was called entrenching. It was the fastest but the most dangerous. Soldiers would dig straight down, but when they did that, they would be exposed to enemy fire. The next method is called sapping. It was simply to extend the trench that was already there. The final method was called tunneling. Soldiers would tunnel down and then remove the roof of the tunnel to make a trench. This is the safest but slowest way. The trenches were extremely dirty. They consistently had pests and rats, lice, and frogs. Lice also caused a disease called trench fever that made the soldiers itch terribly and caused fever, headache, sore muscles, bones, and joints. Many soldiers suffered from trench fever, and when it rained, it would only make it worse. On the Christmas of 1914, the soldiers decided enough was enough and had a 1 day truce. They put down their weapons and played soccer. This is known as the Christmas truce.
The soldiers followed a schedule very similar to what I'm about to say. They would wake up at 5 a.m. and at 5:30 they would eat breakfast. At 6 a.m. they would stand down and they would have some fun. At 7 a.m. they would have bacon and tea for a break. And after 8 a.m. they would clean themselves, their weapons, and tidy up the trench. At noon they had dinner, and after dinner there was sleep and downtime. Their sleep schedule was so messed up that they had to eat dinner at noon. At 5 p.m. they had tea, and at 6 p.m. they patrolled. At 6:30 that's when they rested, and 6:30 onward is where everyone took shifts looking out. The main reason why the trenches existed in World War I was because of machine guns. Machine guns were huge guns that would carry lots of ammo, but they would be very slow and hard to handle. Both sides had them, and since they couldn't be that agile, they both decided to just hunker down. And so thus trench warfare began. Soldiers were fighting a big war, in a world war. And on top of that, they had to make big, long, quality trenches that would protect their troops. The longest trench being the Regina Trench. It's in Canada and stretches 3 kilometers. The trenches were huge and hard to make. The British said it took 450 men 6 hours to build about 250 meters of a trench system. The trenches had 3 parts. The front line, where most of the action took place, the support trenches, where they would support the front line, and the resting trenches, where they would play cards and enjoy their time together. Thank you for watching. This was made by Robert, Michael, and Sage.